The human man kissed her, not knowing that she was the deadliest alien vampire woman in the galaxy. Nexus City didn't sleep so much as shift into a different frequency after dark. The entertainment district's neon arteries pulsed with bioluminescent advertisements that crawled across building facades like living organisms, their light refracting through the perpetual drizzle of acid rain held back by flickering force shields. Jax walked through the chromatic haze with his collar turned up against the mist. 3,000 credits from his last smuggling run weighing heavy in his jacket's encrypted pocket. The consortium patrol had nearly caught him at the Helios checkpoint, but nearly didn't count when you were still breathing and spending. The Obsidian Lounge materialized from the visual chaos, like it always did, its entrance a slash of darkness that somehow felt more honest than all the synthetic brightness surrounding it. Jax descended the rain-slick steps, nodding to the Thaxian bouncer whose forearms were completely unnecessary for handling the usual clientele, but made an impressive statement about the establishment's commitment to security. Inside, the air hung thick with a dozen different atmospheres mixing badly. The ventilation system wheezed, trying to accommodate oxygen breathers, methane enthusiasts, and the occasional silicon-based regular who just liked the music. Holographic dancers flickered through routines programmed sometime before the war, their movements slightly out of sync with the bass that rattled Jax's sternum. He shouldered through the crowd of humans, near humans, and things that had never been human, trading his usual banter with Cole behind the bar. "That's not Jovian whiskey," Jax said, eyeing the amber liquid Cole poured with suspicion. "It's from Jupiter's moons. Technically Jovian. Technically illegal. So's your cargo hold, but I don't judge." Cole slid the glass across the synthwood counter with a grin that showed too many teeth. New shipment came in from the outer rim. Tastes like regret and battery acid. My favorite combination. Jax lifted the glass, then stopped mid-motion as his gaze snagged on something across the bar that made the rest of the chaos fade into background static. She sat alone in the corner booth, impossibly still in a place where everyone else moved with the jittery energy of stimulants or fear. Her skin was porcelain white, not the pallor of someone who avoided sun, but something more fundamental, like she was carved from marble that had learned to breathe. Dark hair fell past shoulders wrapped in a coat that looked expensive in a way that didn't advertise itself. But it was her ears that marked her as different, elongated and elegant, barely visible beneath those waves of darkness, the points catching light like weapon edges. Their eyes met across the press of bodies, and Jax felt something click into place that he couldn't name, some recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with gravity. He crossed the distance without deciding to, glass still in hand, wearing what he hoped was a charming smile rather than the confused expression he felt. "So," he said, "do you come here often, or are you just waiting for the health inspector to shut this place down?" Her lips curved into something that might have been amusement. They were dark as midnight, a shade that didn't come from any cosmetic he recognized. "The health inspector came last week. He's still trying to identify what he found in the kitchen." "That explains the special." Jax gestured to the empty seat across from her, and she nodded. Up close, she was even more striking, her features arranged in proportions that seemed mathematically perfect, while somehow remaining entirely organic. "Jax," he said. "Selene. That's a name from old Earth mythology. Moon goddess, right? You know your ancient history." Something flickered in her dark eyes, an expression that suggested she knew exactly how ancient. "I had a lot of time to read between smuggling runs." He took a sip of the terrible whiskey, wincing. Cole wasn't lying about the battery acid part. And the regret? That comes after the third glass. Jax settled into the worn synth leather seat, surprised at how natural this felt, talking to a stranger who looked at him like she could see through all the practiced deflections he usually wore. "So what brings someone who's clearly too sophisticated for this establishment to the Obsidian Lounge on a Tuesday night?" "Is it Tuesday?" Selene tilted her head slightly, those elongated ears catching the light. "I lose track sometimes. The days tend to blur together in Nexus City." "Tell me about it." "Last week I delivered a cargo container to the wrong planet entirely. Spent 3 days arguing with customs officials about whether Arcturus Prime and Arcturus Station count as the same destination. And do they? According to the consortium's legal department, absolutely not. According to the logic of anyone with a functioning brain, close enough. He leaned forward, drawn by the way she listened, like his words actually mattered. You never answered my question, though. What brings you here? Celine's gaze drifted across the bar, cataloging faces and exits with an efficiency that suggested training or instinct. Curiosity, she said finally, and a certain appetite for atmosphere. Well, this place has atmosphere. Most of it carcinogenic, but still. Jax raised his glass in mock salute. To bad decisions and worse ventilation systems. She smiled then, really smiled, and the expression transformed her face from beautiful to something that caught his breath. To bad decisions, she echoed, though she didn't drink. Around them, Jax didn't notice how the crowd had begun to shift, providing their table with more space than coincidence would allow. He didn't see the figures in the shadows, motionless as Celine herself, watching with eyes that reflected the neon light in shades no human iris could produce. He only saw her, and the way she laughed at his terrible jokes like they were actually funny, and felt that dangerous certainty settling over him that this night was going to change everything. The conversation between them flowed with the ease of reconnecting old friends, rather than strangers meeting in a dingy bar. Jax found himself talking about things he usually kept locked behind careful deflections, the words spilling out while Celine listened, with that unnerving intensity. She asked about his ship, and he told her about the Meridian, a Corellian freighter held together by spite and improvised repairs. She asked about his cargo, and he admitted to running medical supplies to colony worlds the consortium had abandoned, though he dressed it up with jokes about creative accounting and flexible morality. So you're a criminal with a conscience, Celine said, her dark lips curving. That must be exhausting. You have no idea. The guilt really cuts into my profit margins. Jax gestured for another round, though Celine's first drink remained untouched, the ice long since melted into sad little puddles. What about you? What's your story? I'm in acquisitions. She said it with a straight face that made him laugh. That's the most corporate way of saying criminal I've ever heard. I prefer to think of it as freelance resource management. Her fingers traced patterns on the table's surface, and Jax noticed how pale they were, almost translucent in the shifting light. I've been doing it for a very long time. Yeah? How long we talking? 5 years? 10? Something ancient moved behind her eyes. Let's just say I remember when Nexus City was still called New Shanghai, before the atmospheric processors failed and they had to rebuild everything underground. Jax blinked. That was over 2 centuries ago. You're telling me you're that old? What, did they put you in cryo for a few decades? Something like that. Celine's smile didn't quite reach her eyes this time. Time moves differently when you've seen as much as I have. Empires rise and fall. Species that seemed eternal go extinct. The consortium controls everything until suddenly it doesn't. Dark stuff for a Tuesday night. Jax leaned back, studying her. You one of those life extension enthusiasts? I knew a guy on Titan who swore by nanite treatments. Last I heard, his liver was trying to evolve into a separate organism. Nothing so crude as nanites. She tilted her head and those elongated ears caught the light again, making her look fey and dangerous. Tell me more about your colony, the one the consortium seized. The deflection was smooth enough that Jax almost didn't notice her steering the conversation away from herself. Almost. But he let it happen because talking about Theros Station hurt less when those dark eyes were watching him with something that looked like genuine empathy. He told her about the farms that grew wheat under artificial suns, about his mother's lab where she'd engineered crops that could survive in low gravity, about the day the consortium ships arrived with their legal documents and their weapons, and their absolute certainty that property rights mattered more than people's homes. I was 17, Jax said, staring into his empty glass. Old enough to be angry, too young to do anything about it. So I learned to fly, learned to smuggle, learned to be the kind of pain in their ass that my mom would have lectured me about. She would have been proud. Celine's voice carried a certainty that made him look up. The best revenge against systems that crush people is refusing to be crushed. That's either very wise or very stupid. Haven't decided which yet. Most worthwhile things are both. She glanced toward the bar's entrance, and for a moment her expression went carefully blank. Jax followed her gaze but saw only the usual traffic of patrons stumbling in and out. You should be careful, Jax. Nexus City isn't safe for people who carry hope around like you do. It tends to attract predators. Speaking from experience? More than you know. She stood with fluid grace that seemed to defy the bar's artificial gravity. Walk with me. I need air that doesn't taste like recycled desperation. Jax threw credits on the table and followed her toward the exit, only then realizing how the crowd parted for her without seeming to notice they were doing it. The other patrons gave them space like water flowing around stones, and in the shadows near the bathrooms, he caught glimpses of figures that went statue still as Celine passed. They had the same elongated ears, the same impossible pallor, and when one of them met his eyes briefly, Jax felt his hindbrain screaming warnings his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. Outside, the acid rain had intensified to a proper downpour, the force shields overhead crackling with the effort of deflection. Moisture still got through in a fine mist that clung to exposed skin like cold regret. Celine walked into it without hesitation, her dark coat repelling water like it was coated in something more sophisticated than fabric treatment. Jax followed, suddenly aware that he'd just left a crowded bar with a woman he didn't know, heading into the labyrinth of Nexus City's back passages with nothing but his plasma pistol and increasingly questionable judgment for protection. You know, he said, catching up to her as she turned down an alley he'd never noticed before. This is exactly how horror vids start. Charming stranger, dark alley, ominous rain. Usually doesn't end well for the guy making jokes. Celine looked back at him, and in the neon-reflected puddles, her smile looked sharp enough to draw blood. Then I suppose you'd better keep making jokes. As long as I'm laughing, you're probably safe. Probably isn't exactly reassuring. No, she agreed, turning back into the darkness. It's really not. The alley twisted through Nexus City's underground architecture, like a secret the builders had forgotten to mention. Celine moved through the darkness with predatory confidence, never hesitating at intersections, never checking the glowing nav markers that most people relied on to avoid getting lost in the district's maze. Jax followed, occasionally stumbling over debris he couldn't see in the dim light, cursing in 3 different languages when his boot caught on something that might have been a discarded food synthesizer or possibly a sleeping vagrant. You know where you're going, right? He called out, watching her pale form drift ahead like a ghost through the mist. Because I'm pretty sure we just passed the same graffiti twice. Someone really doesn't like the consortium's trade policies. Can you blame them? Celine's voice floated back, touched with amusement. And yes, I know exactly where I'm going. I've walked these passages since before your grandfather was born. There's that cryptic age thing again. You're really committing to the mysterious ancient being routine. Who says it's a routine? The alley opened into a wider space behind what Jax recognized as the Obsidian Lounge's back wall. The bass from inside throbbed through the concrete like a mechanical heartbeat, and overhead the force shields crackled and spat as rain hammered against them. Water still made it through in sheets, running down the walls in streams that caught the neon glow from distant advertisements. Celine stopped in the center of the space, tilting her face up toward the failing shields, letting the mist coat her porcelain skin. Do you know what I miss most about old Earth? She asked, and her voice carried something raw that hadn't been there before. Real rain, not this acid-laced recycled mess, but actual water falling from actual clouds. I used to stand in storms and feel alive. Jax moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her words. That was definitely more than 2 centuries ago. Earth's weather systems collapsed during the climate wars. Unless you're about to tell me you're pushing 400 years old, which would make you the worst preserved person in history? She laughed, sharp and bright against the rain sound. I could tell you the truth, but you'd think I was insane. Try me. I once delivered a shipment to a colony that worshipped a malfunctioning AI as God. My bar for insanity is pretty high. Celine turned to face him fully, and in the fractured light her eyes looked fathomless, ancient in a way that made his joke die in his throat. What if I told you I remember the climate wars? That I watched New Shanghai burn, then watched them rebuild it as Nexus City, then watched it sink into the ground? What if I said I've seen 1,000 sunrises on worlds that don't exist anymore? I'd say you either have the galaxy's best rejuvenation treatments, or you're not exactly human. Jax kept his tone light, even as his hand drifted unconsciously toward his pistol. Those ears aren't just cosmetic, are they? No, they're very much real. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see his reflection in her dark eyes. You should be frightened of me, Jax. Any sensible person would be. Yeah, well, sensible people don't smuggle consortium medical supplies to rebel colonies. He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed his fingers against one of those elongated ears. The skin was cool, impossibly smooth, and when she inhaled sharply, he felt it more than heard it. You going to tell me what you really are, or do I have to keep guessing? What if I said vampire? The word hung between them like a blade. Would you run? Jax considered this, his finger still touching her ear, feeling her pulse thrumming beneath the surface with a rhythm that seemed too slow for human biology. Vampires are supposed to be a myth, something colonists made up to explain the Wraith attacks in the Outer Rim. Myths have to start somewhere, and you're telling me they started with you. He should have been backing away, reaching for his weapon, calling for help on his comm. Instead, he found himself leaning closer, fascinated by the way she held herself so carefully still, like she was restraining something massive. That's either the truth or the best pickup line I've ever heard. It's not a line. Celine's voice had gone rough, strained. I'm trying to warn you, you beautiful idiot. I'm trying to give you a chance to leave before I do something we'll both regret. What if I don't want to leave? The words came out before he could think them through, reckless and honest. What if this is the most interesting conversation I've had in years, and I don't care if you're human or vampire, or some kind of sentient hologram? She made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You're going to get yourself killed. Probably. Been the plan since I was 17. He closed the last distance between them, his hand sliding from her ear to cup her face, feeling how cool her skin was against his palm. But at least I'll go out doing something stupid for a good reason. This isn't good. This is the opposite of good. Yeah. Jax smiled, the same reckless grin that had gotten him through consortium checkpoints and into more trouble than he could count. But when has that ever stopped anyone? He kissed her before she could protest again, before his survival instincts could override his terrible judgment. Her lips were cold against his, tasting of something sweet and metallic like copper mixed with dark honey, strange and intoxicating. For a suspended moment she went rigid, and Jax thought maybe he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then her fingers gripped his jacket with inhuman strength, and she kissed him back with an intensity that felt like drowning and flying simultaneously. The rain fell harder around them, the city's bass throb matching his racing heart. And Jax thought distantly that if this was how he died, at least it would make one hell of a story. Celine tore herself away from him with such violent force that Jax stumbled backward, catching himself against the wet concrete wall. She pressed her hands flat against the opposite wall, like she needed the physical barrier to keep from closing the distance again, her whole body trembling with restraint that looked painful. Her eyes had gone wide, pupils dilated, until only a thin ring of color remained, and when she opened her mouth to speak, Jax saw what he'd somehow missed before. Her canines had lengthened into points sharp enough to pierce steel, gleaming wet in the neon light. "Oh," he said, with remarkable calm considering his hindbrain was screaming. "So the vampire thing wasn't metaphorical. You need to leave." Her voice came out strained, barely human. "Right now, Jax. Walk away and don't look back." That's probably excellent advice. He stayed exactly where he was, watching her fight whatever urge was tearing through her. But I'm noticing I have a pattern of ignoring excellent advice. It's kind of my thing. This isn't funny. She squeezed her eyes shut, fingers digging into the concrete hard enough that cracks spiderweb from her grip. Do you have any idea what you just did? What you offered me? I kissed a beautiful woman who might be a centuries-old predator. In retrospect, I see some flaws in my risk assessment. Jax found his hand moving toward his plasma pistol again, not to draw it, but just to confirm it was still there. A security blanket that probably wouldn't help much against something that could crush concrete. For what it's worth, you taste weird. Not bad weird, just weird weird. Like Pennies and Honey had a fight. A sound escaped her that might have been a laugh or a growl. That's my venom mixing with your blood chemistry. If I'd bitten you, you wouldn't have felt any pain. Just euphoria until you were too empty to feel anything at all. Okay, that's significantly less romantic than the old Earth stories made it sound. He pushed off from the wall, taking one careful step toward her. But you didn't bite me. You're standing over there having what looks like a really unpleasant internal struggle instead of, draining me dry. That's got to count for something. It counts for nothing. Celine's eyes snapped open, fixing on him with predatory focus that made every animal instinct in his body scream to run. I am 347 years old. I have fed on thousands across dozens of star systems. They call me the Crimson Wraith in the Outer Rim, and colonies tell stories about me to frighten their children. I have ended bloodlines and toppled governments and never once hesitated when prey offered itself to me. And yet here you are, not eating me. Jax kept his voice light even though his heart hammered against his ribs. That's either character growth or you're on some kind of vampire diet. Please tell me it's not the sparkly kind, because I don't think I could handle that level of melodrama. How are you making jokes right now? It's a coping mechanism. I joke or I panic, and panic seems counterproductive. He took another step, then another, closing the distance with the kind of stupid courage that had kept him alive through situations that should have killed him. Talk to me, Celine. What's happening here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying really hard not to hurt me, which suggests you're not quite the monster you're claiming to be. I'm exactly the monster I'm claiming to be. Her voice cracked on the words. But you're right about one thing. I'm trying not to hurt you, and I don't understand why. For centuries I've hunted without conscience, without hesitation, without anything resembling what humans call mercy. Then some smuggler with terrible jokes and a death wish kisses me, and suddenly I'm standing here fighting every instinct I have. Movement in the shadows behind her made Jax's hand finally close on his pistol grip. Figures emerged from the darkness, 7 of them, all with that same inhuman pallor and those elongated ears. They moved with coordinated grace that suggested pack hunting, spreading out to cut off escape routes Jax hadn't even identified yet. The one in front, a male with silver markings traced along his ears and throat, smiled with too many teeth. Well, the male said in accented standard, his voice carrying amusement and cruelty in equal measure. This is unexpected. The legendary Crimson Wraith, paralyzed by conscience over a human. He switched to another language, liquid and ancient, directing words at Celine that made her flinch. She responded in the same tongue, her voice carrying authority that pushed back against his mockery. Jax didn't need translation to understand the threat in the exchange. His hand tightened on his pistol, calculating odds that weren't good. 7 vampires, 1 human, and a narrow alley with no real cover. Even if his weapon could drop 1 or 2 before they closed the distance, the rest would tear him apart in seconds. Jax, Celine said without taking her eyes off the silver-marked vampire. When I tell you to run, you run. Don't argue, don't look back. Just go. Yeah, that's not happening. Don't be stupid. Too late. Already kissed the vampire. Might as well commit to the bad decisions. He pulled the pistol free slowly, keeping it pointed at the ground but ready. So who are your friends? Let me guess, Vampire Book Club? Support group for creatures of the night? The silver-marked one laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He makes jokes while standing in his grave. I almost like him, Celine. It would be a shame to waste such entertaining prey. The silver-marked vampire circled them with the casual menace of something that had never known fear, his movements fluid despite the broken terrain. The others held their positions at strategic points around the alley, cutting off every exit with practiced efficiency. Jax kept his pistol ready but didn't aim, recognizing that any aggressive move would trigger a response he couldn't survive. Celine remained between him and the encircling predators, her posture coiled with tension. Corvus, she said, and her voice carried weight that made even the other vampires straighten slightly. This doesn't concern you or the others. Leave now and we can all pretend this encounter never happened. Corvus tilted his head, those silver markings catching the neon light like circuitry embedded in flesh. But it does concern us, Celine. When the Crimson Wraith suddenly develops a conscience in the middle of Nexus City's entertainment district, word spreads. When she's seen spending hours with a human, letting him walk away from a kiss that should have been his last breath, people talk. We came to see if the rumors were true. And now you've seen. Congratulations. Celine's fingers flexed at her sides, and Jax noticed how her nails had sharpened into claws that could probably shred his body armor like tissue paper. The show's over. Time to go. Oh, I don't think so. Corvus switched back to that liquid ancient language, speaking rapid sentences that made the other vampires shift with interest. Celine responded sharply, her words cutting like weapons, but Corvus only smiled wider. He addressed Jax directly, returning to standard. She's telling me to leave you alone, that you're under her protection. Do you know what that means in our culture, human? I'm guessing it's not a frequent buyer program. Jax kept his tone light despite his racing pulse. Maybe a rewards card. Collect 10 bites, get one free? It means she's claiming you as precious. Not prey, not cattle, but something worth preserving. Corvus moved closer, and Celine matched his movement, maintaining herself as a barrier. For our kind, protection is sacred. It's also incredibly rare, because it means admitting that something matters more than hunger, that a human life has value beyond the blood in their veins. That's very touching. I'm feeling really special right now. Jax glanced at Celine, reading the rigid tension in her shoulders. But I'm sensing there's a downside to this whole protection arrangement. The downside, Corvus said, his amusement darkening into something colder, is that protected humans become targets. If another of our kind wants to hurt Celine, challenge her status, or simply cause chaos, they go after what she's protecting. You're not just marked as off-limits, a smuggler. You're marked as leverage. Great. So I went from anonymous nobody to galactic vampire politics in one evening. My life choices are really paying off. One of the other vampires, a female with hair like spun copper, spoke in their ancient tongue. Corvus nodded, then addressed Celine again. Kira raises an excellent point. You could simply feed now. End this before it becomes complicated. The human offered himself freely with that kiss. By our oldest laws, you would be within your rights. No one would question your choice, and you could return to what you were before this moment of weakness. Celine's whole body went rigid. He's not a moment of weakness. Then what is he? Corvus spread his hands in a gesture that managed to be both curious and threatening. What could possibly be worth entering the political nightmare you're about to face? Protected humans are rare for a reason, Celine. The last one documented was nearly a century ago, and you remember what happened to Mira when rival factions decided to test her commitment. Mira was young and isolated. Celine's voice dropped to something dangerous. I am neither. No, you're the Crimson Wraith, legendary and feared. Corvus stopped circling, planting himself directly in front of her with only a few meters separating them. Which makes this situation even more fascinating. The hunter who never hesitates, suddenly paralyzed by something resembling emotion. Tell me, old friend, when did you become so human? The insult landed like a physical blow. Celine moved with speed that Jax's eyes couldn't track, closing the distance and gripping Corvus by the throat hard enough that the concrete beneath their feet cracked from the force. She lifted him effortlessly, speaking in that ancient language with words that came out like knives. The other vampires tensed but didn't intervene, watching with the fascination of predators witnessing a dominance display. Corvus didn't struggle, just smiled with bloody teeth where Celine's grip had pierced skin. When she finally released him, he landed in a crouch that looked more like a bow. There she is, he said, rubbing his throat where dark blood welled. I was worried you'd gone completely soft. I could tear you apart before your allies could blink. Celine stood over him, every line of her body radiating lethal capability. The only reason I don't is because we have history, and because I want you to carry a message back to anyone who's interested in my business. This human is under my protection by right of ancient law. Anyone who touches him answers to me. Anyone who questions my choice can come say it to my face instead of sending scouts to test my resolve. Understood. Corvus rose slowly, still smiling, despite the blood staining his collar. But you should know that choice has consequences. The council will want to speak with you. Faction leaders will see opportunity, and there are those who've waited centuries for a chance to challenge the Crimson Wraith when she's distracted by something fragile. Let them come. Celine's voice carried absolute certainty. I've survived 300 years of politics, wars, and rivals. I'm not concerned about vampires who think protection makes me weak. Then I suppose we'll see how this plays out. Corvus gestured to the others, and they began withdrawing into shadows with the same coordinated grace they'd arrived with. Before he disappeared entirely, he looked back at Jax. Good luck, smuggler. You're going to need it. The vampires melted back into Nexus City's shadows like they'd never existed, leaving only the echo of Corvus's warning and the cracked concrete beneath Celine's feet as evidence of what had just transpired. The rain continued its steady assault on the force shields overhead, the crackling intensifying as the system struggled under the storm's weight. Jax finally holstered his pistol, realizing his hand had gone numb from gripping it so tightly. So, he said into the sudden silence, that was intense. On a scale of 1 to completely screwed, where would you rate my current situation? Celine turned to face him, and the predatory tension had drained from her body, leaving behind something that looked disturbingly like exhaustion. Her canines had retracted, her nails returned to normal, but her eyes still held that ancient weight that reminded him she'd lived longer than most human civilizations. Honestly, I don't know. I've never done this before. Protected someone? Jax moved closer, no longer sure if he was being brave or suicidal, but finding he didn't particularly care. Seems like a pretty big decision to make on the fly. Usually people start smaller, maybe get a houseplant first, work their way up to keeping humans alive. I've had houseplants. They died. A smile flickered across her face, fragile and uncertain. 347 years, and I've never let anyone close enough to matter. I told myself it was survival, that attachment was a weakness I couldn't afford. Then you made that stupid joke about the health inspector and looked at me like I was a person instead of a predator. To be fair, I didn't know you were a predator at that point. Ignorance made me fearless. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the fine tracery of veins beneath her translucent skin. But I know now, and I'm still here. That's got to count for something, right? Celine reached up slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and touched his face with fingers that trembled despite their supernatural strength. You should be running. You should be terrified. Instead, you're making jokes and standing in the rain with a creature that could kill you without effort. Yeah, well, I watched the consortium take everything from people I loved and learned that playing it safe doesn't actually keep you safe. It just makes you small. Jax caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. Besides, you had every opportunity to drain me dry back there, and you chose not to. You fought your nature, threatened your own kind, and put yourself in danger to protect someone you barely know. That tells me more about who you are than 3 centuries of hunting ever could. You're an idiot, her voice broke on the words. So I've been told, usually right before I do something that either saves my life or ends it spectacularly. He pulled her closer, feeling how she held herself carefully, still afraid of her own strength. What happens now? Do we fight off vampire assassins? Go into hiding? Start a support group for humans dating supernatural predators? I don't know. Celine leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder in a gesture that felt achingly vulnerable. The council will summon me. Rival factions will test whether I mean what I said. There will be challenges, political maneuvering, and probably violence. Your life just became exponentially more complicated and dangerous. My life was already complicated and dangerous. Yesterday, I had to outrun a consortium cruiser while carrying illegal medical supplies. Last week, someone tried to blow up my ship because I refused to transport weapons to a separatist colony. Danger is kind of my baseline. He wrapped his arms around her, acutely aware of the strangeness of holding something that looked human but felt fundamentally other. The real question is whether you're okay with this, with me, because I'm getting the sense you just upended your entire existence on an impulse, and that's usually when the regret sets in. She pulled back enough to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize it. I don't regret it. That's what terrifies me. For the first time in 3 centuries, I feel something besides hunger and emptiness. You make me remember what it was like to be human, to care about something more than survival. I don't know if that's beautiful or tragic. Could be both. Most worthwhile things are. Jack smiled, echoing her words from earlier. Look, I'm not going to pretend I understand vampire politics or ancient laws or whatever nightmare we just signed up for. But I do understand that life's too short to walk away from something real just because it's complicated, even if my life might be significantly shorter now than it was an hour ago. That's not funny. It's a little funny. He brushed wet hair back from her face, his fingers tracing the elegant point of her ear. Here's what I'm thinking. We take this one day at a time. You teach me how to not get immediately murdered by your kind. I teach you how to laugh at terrible jokes and maybe remember what it's like to be more than just a hunter. We figure out this whole protection arrangement thing together, and if vampire assassins show up, well, I've got a ship and I'm really good at running away. Celine kissed him then, soft and careful, tasting less of copper this time and more like rain and possibilities. When she pulled back, something had shifted in her expression, the ancient weight lifting enough to let something younger, more hopeful, shine through. You're definitely going to get us both killed. Probably, but at least we'll go out doing something interesting. Jax took her hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt both casual and monumental. Come on, I've got a ship docked in Sector 7. We should probably get out of this alley before more of your friends show up with opinions about your life choices. They're not my friends. Fair point. Judgmental, immortal acquaintances, then. He tugged her toward the alley's exit, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. So, tell me honestly, on a scale of 1 to existential crisis, how much trouble are we actually in? Celine laughed, the sound surprising them both with its genuine warmth. Catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. Perfect. That's exactly my speed. Jax grinned as they emerged into Nexus City's neon-soaked chaos, a smuggler and a vampire walking hand in hand through the rain, like it was the most natural thing in the galaxy. Somewhere above them, the storm raged against failing shields. Somewhere in the shadows, ancient predators watched and calculated. But for this moment, in this rain-slicked alley behind a bar that served terrible whiskey, Jax had never felt more alive. The end.